Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. Today, we're joined by Lisa Miller, President of Lisa W. Miller and Associates, a marketing strategy and innovation practice, and author of the book, The Business of Joy. Lisa has spent the last 3 decades translating consumer data into well-integrated, actionable insights that unlock profitable sales and business growth. Lisa's work has been featured nationally in over 200 media interviews and speaking engagements, including NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, The Wall Street Journal, Nation's Restaurant News, and many more. Very impressive. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thank you so much. This is going to be super fun.
Yes. So let's start out the episode the way that we really like to, with the most significant thing that you're wanting to share with us today.
Well, when I start on this journey back to joy, which we'll get to, my big significant learning is that joy is not just something squishy, and it is good for our soul, but joy actually is what can propel the economy, propel retention. So that's why I always talk about the business of joy. So that's what we're going to have fun talking about.
Great. I can't wait to dive into this. So reflecting on the 30 years that you have worked as a consumer insights and innovation strategist, how has your approach to understanding consumers evolved?
Well, I started, I worked in restaurants, I worked in packaged goods like Frito-Lay, PepsiCo, but I've always had this curiosity to ask questions for sure, just growing up, it's just in my DNA. But when I was at Frito-Lay, which was a hot minute ago, we actually had these really amazing opportunities where 2 or 3 times a year, we would bring in companies that were experimenting with new marketing research tools and techniques. And so I learned at a very early stage in my career to keep sharp on how you do your craft. And not only did we get exposure to these companies and these tools, each of us, which is like unheard of today, but each of us actually got a small little amount of money to experiment with these new tools and see what they could bring to the table. And so I just feel like we do innovation for our stakeholders, our clients, our customers, our internal customers. But if we don't stay innovative in our thinking and our approach, we become stale as kind of a industry practice. So I really try to stay sharp.
Nice, it's good advice. So one of the reasons why we've got you on the show today is to talk about your book, The Business of Joy. And I believe that was inspired by insights gathered during the pandemic. So do you want to share what led you to explore the concept of joy in such a challenging time?
Well, it is kind of one of these things. I mentioned to you, I live in Dallas, Texas. I've had my own company since 2008. And when the pandemic started, I remember to a T, it was March, and then it was Friday, March 13th when the world shut down. But I literally, meetings started being canceled, projects started being canceled. I had huge projects, like big segmentation studies that they're like, can't pay you right now. So it was just a very unsettling time. But so I even asked my clients, I said, how can I help? Because how do we raise the water levels for everybody? But there was so much fear and nobody had any time. I mean, a lot of my clients were restaurants, so you can imagine what was going on there. And they were just trying to keep the lights on. But so I kind of said, okay, well, let me see what I can do to help. And I don't know if you remember, Michael, do you remember back when the pandemic started that, everybody was baking bread, or maybe there were those YouTube videos of, artists singing, a cappella, and people were just trying to find different ways to spend their time. Do you remember all those things?
I do, and maybe a few Bob Ross paintings were painted at the same time as well.
Exactly, right. And so what I realized, so I couldn't even hardly give away research because nobody had time. But at the same time, there was so much free data, right? So everybody was, publishing data. But what I thought about was it was all about the virus. So literally, I mean, if you can imagine this, Michael, I am walking, my husband and I would, because we had time, we took walks like every single day. And in our neighborhood, they had these people were painting rocks with hopeful messages. I don't know if they had that in New Zealand, but I found this rock and it was "You make joy." And I will tell you, this is no doubt, is I had this moment that said when joy was greater than fear, the economic recovery would begin because
Mm,
we were all so scared. And, everything that, many things that were joyful, going to movies, going to eat, going to church, these things that were joyful were stripped away. And I said, but until we're over the fear, we're not going to leave our houses. And so 1 week into the pandemic, Michael, I literally said, I'm going to start out of my own pocket, even though I don't know where any income is going to come from. I decided to do 1,000 surveys every single week in the beginning of the pandemic. And it was measuring joy, not fear, because I wanted to know what were the things people missed the most. And if they missed it the most, what are the things that were going to come back? Because if you, and in those research early days, people were saying, how likely are you going to go to a restaurant in the next 30 days? Well, how do you know? Because you
yeah.
don't know how you're going to feel. The restaurants are closed. So I didn't ask those questions. I asked a lot of different. So at the end of the day, I was measuring joy in March of 2020 when everybody else was measuring fear.
Nice. And how long did you keep up those 1,000 surveys for?
I'm still doing them today.
Oh, wow.
So
Um,
I am in wave 78 of this little tracker that I started. And I did it weekly, probably for the first 16 or 20 weeks,
mhm.
weekly. And then I moved to every other week, and then I moved to monthly. But I'll tell you one thing that was so fascinating, because I know I love the fact I don't get to talk about the research side of this much, so I'm geeking out with you.
Yeah.
I
No,
love the
sure.
fact, yeah, I love having an audience that can appreciate it. But when you think about, I'm not sure New Zealand when everything opened up, but in the United States, it was, May, June when things started opening in some parts of the country. And people were like, yay, the doors are going to open. But my data showed that, like, while we were so excited, it was when the doors finally opened, it collided with reality, and that we were actually really scared, which is why
Mm.
the recovery didn't happen as fast as it people thought it would, because we were too scared.
Mm. We will jump back to the book, but we'll just keep pulling on this for a second. Have has when did the levels of joy level out and find their equilibrium?
Well, it's a great question because what happened during the pandemic is July of 2020 is when the fear was at its peak. And there was a lot of other things going on with social unrest. There's a lot of the vaccine controversy that, some people, masks, all of this stuff. So we became fearful, not of just going out, but we became fearful of each other. And so the data that I showed was if you're walking down the street during that time period, you might actually go to the other side of the street if somebody's walking towards you. So we truly became fearful of each other. But then what happened is fast forward by that Christmas time, I always said, was joy going to be in the air? And I actually people thought I was crazy, but I said that people are going to miss those holiday shopping. And believe it or not, the pandemic, there was a lot of joy in the air and people were out and about because they could.
Hmm.
Fast forward to 2021, it was just a roller coaster. So even to this day, so I would say it took a good 2 years to really unwind the fear. But again, for everybody out there listening, here's a really fascinating thing. So during the pandemic in the early years, call it 2020, 2021, advertising. So think about that. All of the advertising was, we're here with you. We're going to get through this. You would see people with masks. You would see people clapping outside. They're, cheering for the frontline workers. You would see somebody having their hand touching a screen. And everybody's like, oh, the warm fuzzies of it all. But guess what? That made everybody more scared and said, wow, I don't want to go out there. It's
Mm.
scary out there. So all of that advertising had a negative unintended consequence of making us more scared. So
Mm.
it made the recovery take longer by the advertising.
Really interesting. And I mean, there was that sense where everyone wanted to kind of do the right thing, wasn't there? But then you don't necessarily think about the macro impact of that.
Yeah, and the other thing that was so interesting, so advertising or email. So imagine all of the email campaigns. And again, nobody had a playbook for running advertising during a pandemic. But even in email marketing, it would be for restaurants or retail shops and the stores that were open, they would lead with all their safety protocols.
Yeah.
And my data showed, and again, I think the listeners can appreciate it, the recovery curve was like an innovation curve. So instead of it being a demographic, like young people are going to go out first, old people are going to stay home. Think of it as a innovation segmentation. So the data was who are going to be the people I'm excited to get out as soon as the doors open versus I'm fearful, I'm anxious, and I'm going to wait a minute. So what happened was is these people that were very excited to go back out, there were young people, there were old people, there were all ages, all demographics, but it was a mindset that
Mm.
I'm ready to go back out to the economy. But what happened was all these emails, think about this, emails that were going out were like safety protocols, safety protocols, safety protocols. And so the people that didn't want to go, they're like, yeah, that's right. I don't need to go because look how scary it is out there. But then the
Mm.
people that were ready to go, they're like, it's not going to be very fun. Like, it's going to be not fun at all. It was like being on another planet. The first time I walked into a restaurant in Texas, I felt like I was on Mars. Everybody had masks on and gloves and single serve everything. And it was just not a good experience.
Mm.
And we wonder why the economy didn't take off because it was not good.
No, I remember after our big lockdown, we, for better or worse, we shut our borders, so it was almost impossible for any non-New Zealanders to come to New Zealand. It was quite difficult for New Zealanders to come to New Zealand that were living
Mm.
overseas. And it may have been, was it June or July? I remember going to a sports game in
Mm.
2020. And like this is probably one of the only sports games around the world that had a crowd, and it was really like we really enjoyed it, and was so
Well,
lucky
if
at
you
the
look at
time.
yeah, I mean, it's back in the States, they had people paid money to have cardboard cutouts of themselves cheering on their fans. And then the
Wow.
other thing that I know, right? Like, especially by the time the Super Bowl came around, and then we piped in music. So for the American football games, they
Yeah.
piped in music, or not music, crowd noise. And can you imagine, like, the producer, like, yay, the crowd goes wild, or the boo, or some producers in the background, pushing
Yeah.
these buttons.
That's right. We digress. Um, so that really, really fascinating. And well done for keeping the study going as well. So if we think back to the book now and during that period, what were some of the most surprising insights that emerged from your conversations then?
Well, one thing just to let everybody know, so not only when I wrote the book, I had about 55,000 surveys that I had completed. And then I also spoke to 16 restaurant CEOs and COOs to really understand what it was like to live through it. So I had the industry leader perspective in addition to the consumer perspective. And what I would say is from the CEO perspective, whether it's the president CEO of Applebee's restaurant or even senior leader at Chuck E. Cheese, the common thread was just the incredible burden that they had to carry. Because if you are a brand that has locations across the country, you had to navigate all of these different rules by county, by city, but also people's livelihoods when you had to furlough people. And it was heart-wrenching because they had to go through it, but then they also shared heartwarming stories. This one executive of a restaurant, she literally was having to lay off, furlough her people, some of her executives, and they basically came back to her, the CEO, with empathy, like, how are you doing? Because I think we take for granted, I mean, all these leaders were humans as well, and they were dealing with their own, safety issues and trying to muddle through when they didn't have the answers. And so it was really just, you saw the humanity come through. And I think that people, when they read the book, they really appreciate, it's like being the Barbara Walters or Oprah Winfrey to try to get the stories, because it was just incredible. But I think the other thing, two other things that happened was it really became so clear by 2021 that the divisiveness, what started as everybody supporting and cheering for each other and we'll get through it, as it lingered on, it's when it got very divisive. And whether it was masks or vaccines, but even when the restaurants reopened, consumers must have lost their mind. I mean, there were all these things where a consumer threw soup on a restaurant employee. They would, have fights. And you wonder why the labor shortage happened. So my data basically showed that the labor shortage was also due to bad customer behavior. So that was a big surprise. Well, it wasn't a big surprise, but it was good to hear, good to see the data support that.
Yeah, sad, but nice to have that the facts, I guess. So yes.
Yeah.
In The Business of Joy, you emphasize the book is not a self-help guide, but is grounded in research and business insights. So can you talk about the key business lessons you discovered and how they apply to today's challenges? Perhaps now more than they did when you wrote the book even.
Well, it is funny because I always kind of wonder, how am I going to write another book? Because everybody's like, let's do another book. So I'm not sure, but I am continuing the research, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm on wave 78, which is just blows me away that I have 78,000 consumers. But the key insight for everybody listening is, when I started the project, fear was around the pandemic. And again, that line is when joy is greater than fear, the economic recovery growth can begin. So what happens is there's different fears now. There's fear of inflation. We just had a very tumultuous election season here, and fear of the outcomes of the election. So those are the things. COVID is not the fear, but all these other things now. So that is also why the economy here is not doing as well, because people are fearful of just other things. So we have to remember that just fear in general holds us back, whether it's fear, all the things I mentioned. But at the same time, as individuals, we can choose joy each and every day. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So the pandemic reshaped the way many businesses operate. Based on your research, what role does joy play in helping businesses adapt and thrive, I guess, in this new normal?
Yeah, and that's such an interesting word, the new normal.
I know.
Which is the new normal. A couple of things that I still get today, 4 years, almost 5 years later, when are my customers coming back? And from a research perspective, I basically say they're never coming back. And I always get this eyebrow raise, like, what? They're never coming back? And the reality of it is they've moved on. And I try to tell companies out there is, you have to remind consumers why they fell in love with your brand in the first place. Because we have new behaviors. We've replaced restaurants, we've replaced activities. We're more home buddies now. And we have to remind people why it's good to get off the sofa and get out and about and interact with people, because we've forgotten. And I think anybody that does marketing research, the other thing that I would say, there's two big points. One is with inflation, it's not that joyful out there with, customer service not being great. It's expensive and it's just not worth it. And so I've added literally almost in every single survey that I do, you have your satisfaction, you have your revisit or repurchase intent. I always ask, is it worth it?
Mm,
Whatever it is. Is it a packaged goods product? Is it a restaurant? Is it a service? Was it worth it? Because that, my friends, everybody in research, that is going to be the biggest leading indicator, not revisit intent, not satisfaction, is was it's worth it.
mm, really interesting. I mean, it made me think about there's a shoe company in New Zealand. You may have heard about them, Allbirds.
Oh yeah.
And so they're made of mainly made of wool or tree fibers. And they had a stat prior to the pandemic where 75% of people who came in store left with a purchase.
Wow.
And so that's a amazing piece in itself. And the pandemic came along, and that obviously um, put a big pause to that there. So, yeah, good big emphasis on being able to get people back into stores as well.
And it is. And I think the other thing too is that, you think about, Michael, your own, like the last time you went to a restaurant, did you have sticker shock when you go to a restaurant?
Uh, I think we don't go to restaurants very often, and so we're prepared for the higher prices, and um, so yeah, it doesn't it hurts, but yes, so there is that
Yeah, and I
sticker
think
shock.
here, you can spend $17, $12 to $17 on McDonald's, which is, crazy. But I think the other thing that just came to my mind is one of the positive and negative unintended consequences for today is during the pandemic, we all paused, many people, not everybody. If you were healthcare, your hair was crazy on fire, but a lot of people, took the moment to reflect and what's important to them in life. And that's the positive unintended consequence. But the negative is what I really worry about. And I do, I've been talking about this for a while, and I'm going to figure out it's my next big research project. So anybody listening, if they want to partner with me, let me know. But I call it like right now Youth in America, but it's basically Gen Z, 16-year-old to 27-year-olds. They're 4 out of 10 are lonely. And if you think about during the people talk about their high schools were interrupted, their colleges were interrupted, life was interrupted more so in these very important years of development. But what people aren't really talking enough about, and this relates to work, is there's a lack of confidence. There's a lack of social skills. A friend of mine who is a executive director at an organization, had an employee that was supposed to go on site for a project. And and it was by herself. She was kind of in charge of it. And she basically said she had a panic attack and she couldn't go.
Wow.
And so it's really unfortunate and sad for her. But then for the company, there was no, that was not good for the company. But so these social skills and lack thereof, it's something that the work as a manager and employee retention, the
Mm,
burden is just beginning. It's not going to get any better. So I think there's a tidal wave of training that's going to need to happen and for employee retention.
mm. Yeah, that's I guess it's a big challenge that yeah we're all going to have to face. So um, one of the main themes your book is the importance of fostering human connection in both personal and professional settings. So I guess that was a good lead up segue to this. How do you see this need influencing the future of work and business innovation?
Yeah, I think building on what we were just talking about is
Mm,
particularly think about, young teenagers that are working at restaurants or the retail jobs or just getting out of college and starting their career. I think that there's going to be an unprecedented burden/opportunity for companies to succeed or fail with this generation to really help them because there's a lot going on out there that life's not fair. I don't have the choices that the generations ahead of me had. And some of that is true, but it's going to
Mm.
be up to some of the companies, I think, to open their hearts a little bit to help provide experiences that they didn't have. I think the other big part of it from a human connection standpoint, everybody talks about employee retention, right? So that's like the buzzword of the day, employee retention, because retention's really challenging right now. There's no
Mm.
loyalty. But if you think about the word retention, and again, I have data to back all this up. So the data, it's basically, if you look it up in the dictionary, retention is actually literally to put a wall around somebody, to retain them, to hold them back, to, keep them in place, right? And so the whole idea of retention is backwards because we shouldn't, as organizations, want to hold something back, hold to protect them for us. We want them to grow as individuals. And the opposite of retention, if you kind of look up the opposites, it's freedom. So imagine a world where we don't talk about retention, but we talk about employee growth. And if they're happy, successful, growing, they're going to stay as the outcome. So I think that there's an opportunity for the training people, the people measuring guest experiences and guest satisfaction and employee engagement. These are all important mind shifts that need to happen moving
Mm.
forward.
That's right. And I mean, businesses need to innovate as well on this whole area of the Gen Z that you mentioned, and it may well be that there was a full-time in office, there was a hybrid, but maybe there needs to be something else and a different kind of working environment to help provide a nice, safe culture for these people to work in.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting, I do some work with a local community college, a 2-year college here in Dallas. And when you talk to students, this whole idea of online only school, college, right? I'm just going to take all my classes online. And
Mm.
you ask a student, what is their preference? And their preference, they might say, oh, I want to take it all online. And nowadays, you might even just be able to deliver all your homework at the very end. So there's no like weekly accountability. It's like come to class, turn in all your work at the end.
Mm.
And so they'll say, yeah, that's my preference. But then if you say, where do you learn the best?
Mm.
Where do you create the interactions? They'll say in person. And so I think as there's a difference between what people say they want versus what they say they need. And it's
Mm.
too easy to go with the former, which is what they want. Oh, we should just do all online because that's what the students say they want. Well, sure, but that's not what they say they need.
Yeah.
And the same is true for work from home and working remote. Again, if you could sit all day at home and not have to go to an office, of course, why most people would say sure. But then you ask, like, what about the opportunities for promotion? What about the opportunities for friendships? And we're asking the wrong questions. And I think we have to be very, very careful in this inflection point of digitization, AI, all this technology, is if we ask the wrong questions, we're going to go down a transactional, non-human path, which again, I think that's the unintended consequences would be very tragic.
Yes. So you emphasize the importance. I actually know. You mentioned that joy can be found in small acts, and I guess sometimes if it is fully online, you miss some of these small acts, like making eye contact or casual conversations. So, how can companies intentionally foster these small but powerful moments of joy to improve workplace culture?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. That's such a great question. Thank you.
And without being tick box as well, because I think some people can see through those too. So
Absolutely. Well, I'll,
mm.
I'll give you a couple of personal examples and then I'll talk about how to apply them, in a business culture world. So part of, I guess, just in my DNA, I've always been one of those people that, you just, you talk to the cashiers or the the DoorDash, the delivery drivers and the servers and things like that, just part of my DNA. So I've always done that. But it's interesting in today's world. I'll give you one example. So I was at a grocery store just probably a couple months ago, and I was talking with this cashier, elderly guy. He's, gray hair, and he had the handlebar mustache, and it was a Trader Joe's. I don't know if everybody knows that name, but we were just talking, and I was just literally having a conversation. How was his day, and how much I enjoyed shopping at this location, and just 5 minutes while I was checking out the groceries and ringing up my groceries. And at the very end, he goes, "Hang on a second." And I didn't know what he was doing. And he stepped away from the register, kind of walked to the side of the store, grabbed something, and came back. And he goes, and he handed me flowers. He goes, "You
Oh,
made my day."
oh wow.
And so these little moments, it took no effort, it cost nothing,
Mm,
that I just was recognizing, talking to him, seeing him as a human being, eye contact, "How was your day?" And he was so touched by that that he went and got me flowers. And
mm,
so anybody and everybody listening to this today can, the next time you go out to the grocery, the dry cleaners, the post office, anywhere, just look up and smile and have eye contact. You might make that person's day, they might make your day. But we're so in this automatic pilot of looking at our phones, and I'm guilty. I mean, I do that myself, but I try not to. But those little moments of joy are priceless and they cost nothing. So
mm,
everybody should start doing that. And then the employees, I did a project the other day, and one of the homework assignments was silly thing, but they went to the grocery store through the persona of their clients or their consumers. We had just done a big segmentation study, and I said, "Hey, go out and be this segment and go shop the stores." And even that little thing opened up their eyes, because we forget all this data. There's people on the other side of this data. And I
mm.
think we forget that as researchers, marketers, leaders. So I always just say choose joy and invest in joy every day.
Yeah, nice. So, how about from a learning and career advancement perspective, as workplaces evolve, what advice would you give leaders who are managing the hybrid or remote teams to try and facilitate or foster joy and connection at that point as well?
Yeah, I think such a tough question right now, because my perspective is I think hybrid is fine, but I do think we spend so much time at work, and I think 100% hybrid roles, they I don't think are good for our humanity or our souls. Again, people may want to do that, but I think there's unintended consequences of that that will pay the price later. So if they are leaders that need to work through this, what I would say is you have to find ways to have those little moments of joy, whether it be little celebrations separately, acknowledging and seeing them. Again, people think it's small talk just to say, "How was your day?" It's really important. People leave companies because of their manager. And if your manager shows interest in you more than just you as an employee, I think the likelihood of building that connection is going to be greater. So it's the same things that you do for in-person employees. You just have to work harder at it.
Mm. I think one other thing that people, I guess, don't necessarily comprehend or understand, particularly when it comes to change management, is if you're trying to embed some form of change, so whether it's new software, new processes, or new personnel, if you just do it all kind of remotely or from up top and down, you don't have the empathy or the connection with people to and therefore the buy-in gets a lot trickier as well. But if you are face to face, if you spend time with those teams, those people, etc., you do create that human connection, and you do have those chances to understand or ask particular things or see how and why something might be changing. So that
I couldn't
face to
agree more.
face.
And yeah, I think the thing that's interesting building on that, Michael, is one of the people I interviewed on my podcast. He was a leader at Dallas College, the 2-year campus. And he had this story where he talked about in today's world, we talk about quality time, right? I
Yeah.
may not have enough time, but I'm going to have quality time with my family, my employees, whatever. But he had a very contrarian view. He goes, you cannot get to, it is physically and emotionally impossible to get to quality time until you invest the quantity of time.
Mm.
And I think that that was so insightful because we seem like, oh, if we see somebody once in a while, we're going to have this great quality time together. And that's just not the case. And so you have to invest in quantity of time before you can get to quality. There are no shortcuts. And I just
That,
thought that was really good.
that's right. And you may have invested in that quantity historically, which enables you to have quality, even if it's just in small, short bursts as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
I think investing in quantity of time is very important. So I think whether it's your employees, your children, your family members, spouses, that you have to invest in quantity of time first.
Yes. So you've been described as a change agent who anticipate macro trends. How do you think companies can better navigate future disruptions or major changes?
Well, I think another colleague of mine, she had a comment saying, right now, striving for certainty is actually a risk. It's not a safety blanket. And what that means is in today's world of uncertainty, if you wait until you're certain, your opportunity's already missed. It's already flown by you. So the speed of change is only it's the slowest it's going to be. It is only going to get faster. And so there's this misnomer that we as humans are not adaptable to change. And it just isn't proven with the data. Humans are very resilient. I mean, that's how we got through COVID. Think of the innovation that happened during COVID. It happened in days, not years, the innovation. So it's very possible, but we have this narrative of fear of failure, fear that somebody's not going to like my idea, and it holds us back. And I
Mm.
think that at the end of the day, you cannot strive for perfection or certainty because you'll miss the boat.
Mm. Do you think the polarization that we've seen sort of take a lot more center stage of late, is that playing into the uncertainty as well?
Certainly here where, this political cycle was very, like, as I said earlier, I use the word tumultuous, and that's probably a nice way of saying it. And so, yes, I think it has gotten divisive. And I hope that through, there's half of America is happy, half of America is not so happy right now with the outcome of the election. But, there have been signals where people are trying to get along. Whether it lasts or doesn't last will be decided. But I think at the end of the day, I ask consumers in my survey about things that matter. And sure, the government noise is all around us, but what they're more concerned about is their day-to-day world. And it
Mm.
goes back to, again, choosing joy as a choice. I'll give one last work example, but I did a little experiment because being that researcher that I am, I'm like, practice what I preach. So there was this, we've all been this. Imagine this, Michael, that you have this call that you really just don't want to be on because it's going to be dreadful. It's going to be contentious. It's just like, sex the living life out of you. We've all had those calls, right? And I was just dreading this one call. And I literally said, you know what? Joy is a choice. They may or may not like the insights or the outcomes that I'm recommending. But if I go in with that really super negative attitude, because I had had some pretty not so good meetings with them, and I
Mm.
decide, I'm going to try this. And I tell you what, I kind of chuckled because it worked. Because I came in, my attitude was a lot better, and I didn't come in with this really negative attitude. I came in with, all I can do is do my best, and I'm going to choose joy, not fear. And that meeting went so much better. So, try those little experiments.
Mm. I mean, equally, like negativity is a choice.
True.
So we choose fear, in one sense. We choose joy. Um, obviously
Without a
not
doubt.
obviously not that simple, and there's a lot of layers and complexity to it, but
But no, but it's that acknowledgement because there's some meetings that you're just kind of like viscerally like, oh, I don't want to go to this meeting. But
mm,
it is a choice. We control our own attitudes. And I think that, as we talked about Gen Z and some employees, there's this whole victim mentality sometimes about jobs and where you are in your life. It's up to ourselves to make the choices, and you choose joy or fear or anger. And honestly, fear leads to anger, which leads to violence, which leads to lots of bad things. But it's all from a sense, starts with a sense of fear.
right. So looking ahead, how can how can market researchers build in joy into what they're doing, and then therefore help their businesses and their consumers, their customers to find that as well?
Well, I would say do lots of experiments and don't be restrictive to, we always did this research approach this way. Try new things and experiment with ways to ask questions, different scales of questions, and just be ahead of the curve because the world around us is changing quickly. And the way we do things has to change to accommodate. So I think that's the first thing. And that's fun when you can innovate and try new things. It's fun. I do think that story I just told about joy is a choice. In market research, sometimes we feel like we don't have a seat at the table and we want people to listen, but you can scream louder and they're not going to listen. And so it's not about it's how you approach the situation is going to be more impactful than just saying, oh, well, the client or my internal stakeholder, they don't get it. How could they not get the insights that I just shared? You have to look in the mirror and say, you know what could I have done differently? So again,
Mm,
instead of playing that victim role, it's like, what could I do differently? And if you did your best, then that outcome, you just have to keep working on it, but you can't always just project on the other person. So that's where joy. And then from a client perspective, any project that it makes sense, ask that worth it question. 5-point scale, it was definitely worth it to not at all worth it. It'll change your world to ask that question if you're not asking it.
mm. Yeah, I mean, the overarching or the fundamentals of market research and the work we do has not changed. Like how we do it may have, but we're still in the business of understanding people and helping our businesses, our organizations understand those consumers and then make better decisions, make positive outcomes from those.
Yeah, reducing the risk. And I guess the other thing I would just say, and this is again can be a more joyful part, is, remind your constituents, again, your clients, your stakeholders, whoever, that I mentioned this earlier, but so important is all of this data and these numbers, there's human beings behind it. So whether you're showing concept test scores or ad test scores or consumer segmentation, you have to remind the audiences of the humans on the other side of it by telling stories. So I spend probably an inordinate amount of time working on my presentations and graphics to really highlight the storytelling, not just a bunch of bar charts.
Hmm. Okay, so if we can just finish on one final takeaway that readers you'd hope would walk away with after reading The Business of Joy, what would that be?
Well, I've said it before, joy is a choice in that we can choose joy over fear each and every day. It's not always butterflies and rainbows, but I promise I have these stickers that say invest in joy and joy is a choice. And I promise you it will change your outlook just to catch yourself when you're having these negativity things. And it is sometimes people think joy is kind of this soft, squishy thing. It is good for our soul, but it's also good for the economy.
Hmm. I actually have one last question, and I promise this will be
Sure.
the last.
No
Writing the
worries.
bus writing The Business of Joy, was it worth it?
Oh my God, Michael, I love that question. And I'm blushing because I'm like, wow, nobody's asked me that. It absolutely was. And the reason is I am, as a researcher, I am compelled to tell that story because our memories will fade. And it's so important to remember the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we experienced so we don't repeat history. And so was it worth it? Without a doubt. And I will, as long as people are interested in hearing joy versus fear, I'll be talking about it because I just think it's that important. So great question.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael. Have a good one.
You're welcome. For all the listeners out there too, thank you for listening, and we would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the podcast, shared this with others, and left a review as well. Don't also forget to check out The Business of Joy as well. We'd be really appreciative for all of those things. Until next time, thanks for listening to Now That's Significant.